Hi, my name is Alex, and I'm your host for this episode of the Charles Manson story. Imagine this. It's November 18th, 1969. A young prosecutor is walking back to his office in Los Angeles, completely unaware that in moments his entire life is about to change. He's about to be dragged into a case involving a bizarre hippie cult, brutal murders of the rich and famous, and a madman named Charles Manson. This is the story of Vincent Bugliosi, the man who would ultimately bring down the Manson family. By November 1969, the Tate-LaBianca murders had already sent shockwaves through Los Angeles. The beautiful actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant along with 4 others, viciously slaughtered in her Benedict Canyon home. The very next night, supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary stabbed dozens of times in their Los Feliz residence. Soon these were to be forevermore known as the Tate-LaBianca murders. For months, the LAPD had been scrambling, following dead ends and false leads. The public was terrified, the press was relentless, and the killers, they were still out there. Vincent Bugliosi was 35 years old, a rising star in the LA District Attorney's Office with an almost perfect record. Of the 104 felony jury trials he'd prosecuted, he'd lost only 1. But nothing could have prepared him for what was coming. The Tate-LaBianca case was the farthest thing from my mind, Bugliosi would later write. He'd just wrapped up a long trial when his colleague Aaron Stovitz, head of the trials division, suddenly grabbed him by the arm and hurried him down the hall without explanation. Moments later, Bugliosi found himself in the office of J. Miller Levy, the director of Central Operations, listening to 2 LAPD lieutenants discussing something about Tate. When Bugliosi asked if they were going to handle the case, Stovitz nodded. Bugliosi's only response was a low whistle. What had happened? After months of dead ends, the LAPD had finally gotten a break. A woman named Susan Atkins, already in custody on unrelated charges, had been bragging to her cellmate about participating in the Tate murders. The cellmate, Ronnie Howard, had gone to authorities. But here's where things get complicated. The case wasn't solved, not by a long shot. Finding suspects is one thing. Proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt is another beast entirely. And they still didn't have all the players identified. As the junior member of the 2-man team, it was Bugliosi's job to work with the LAPD, Tate, and LaBianca squads and follow up on all the new information. Bugliosi was ambitious and a shameless self-promoter. Colleagues enjoyed getting under his thin skin by deliberately mispronouncing his last name. Bugliosi is spelt Bugliosi, but in Italian the letter G is silent. Colleagues and adversaries deliberately pronounced his name Bugliosi, or to really wind him up, they would call him Buggy or Bugsy. But friends and rivals agreed that nobody worked harder or was more thorough than Bugliosi. Bugliosi hated the stereotyped image of the prosecutor, that of a right-wing, law-and-order type, intent on winning convictions at any cost, or the fictional, stumbling, bumbling prosecutor Hamilton Berger, forever trying innocent people who, fortunately, are saved at the last possible minute by the foxy maneuverings of a Perry Mason. He never felt the defense attorney has a monopoly on concern for innocence, fairness, and justice. Traditionally, the role of the prosecutor has been twofold: to handle the legal aspects of the case and to present in court the evidence gathered by law enforcement agencies. Bugliosi never accepted these limitations. In past cases, he always joined in the investigation, going out and interviewing witnesses himself, tracking down and developing new leads, often finding evidence otherwise overlooked. In some cases, this led to the release of a suspect. In others, to a conviction that otherwise might not have been obtained. Bugliosi felt that for a lawyer to do less than his utmost was a betrayal of his client. Though in criminal trials one tends to focus on the defense attorney and his client the accused, the prosecutor is also a lawyer, and he too has a client, the people. And the people are equally entitled to their day in court, to a fair and impartial trial, and to justice. Bugliosi was completely unaware at the time that he would be living with the Tate-LaBianca cases for almost 2 years, averaging 100 hours per week, rarely if ever getting to bed before 2 a.m. 7 days per week. And a life devoid of privacy, his home transformed into a fortress, a bodyguard not only living with him but accompanying him everywhere he went, following a threat by Charles Manson that he would kill Bugliosi. The very next morning, November 19th, Bugliosi decided to take immediate action. Against howling winds, he and several detectives drove 30 miles from downtown Los Angeles to a place called Spahn Ranch, a dilapidated old movie set where Western films had once been shot. This rundown collection of buildings in the middle of nowhere had become home to Charles Manson and his so-called family. Can you picture it? A ramshackle main street visible from the highway, wrecked cars and trucks littering the property, no signs of life. As Bugliosi would later describe it, there was an unreality to the place, accentuated by the roaring wind and the appearance of total desertion. But what made it truly surreal was the knowledge that, if Susan Atkins' story was true, this was the launching pad for the killers. The place where dark-clad assassins would venture out at night to terrorize and kill, then return before dawn to vanish into the surroundings. Accompanying Bugliosi were several detectives and their guide, Danny DiCarlo, a former associate of the family who agreed to help only if they would handcuff him. That way, if any family members were still around, they wouldn't think he was voluntarily cooperating with police. Their first stop was a shack where they found the ranch's owner, 81-year-old George Spahn, nearly blind, wearing dark glasses and a Stetson with a chihuahua in his lap, and a teenage hippie girl making his lunch while a transistor radio tuned to a cowboy station blared Young Love by Sonny James. This was the man who had unwittingly provided Manson and his followers with a home base. Because of Spahn's near blindness, Calkins handed him his badge to feel. Once they had identified themselves, Spahn seemed to relax. When asked for permission to search the property, Spahn replied, "It's my ranch, and you're welcome to search it any time you want to, day or night, and as often as you like." Bugliosi, ever the meticulous prosecutor, made sure to record this consent on tape. He was already thinking ahead to potential trials and legal challenges. But what were they searching for? The group headed to the creek bed behind the ranch where, according to DiCarlo, Manson liked to target practice. Their goal was to find .22 caliber bullets or shell casings that might match those used in the murders. As they searched, more people emerged from the buildings, 10 to 15 young hippies and a few ranch hands. Were some of these people part of Manson's family? They couldn't be sure. In one particularly strange moment, Bugliosi heard noises coming from a doghouse. Leaning down to look inside, he found 2 dogs and, crouched in the corner, a toothless, white-haired elderly woman. When he asked a ranch hand if she needed help, he was told she was happy where she was. This is a strange place, Bugliosi thought. By the end of their search, they had collected approximately 68.22 caliber bullets and 22 shell casings. Small victories, but potential evidence that could prove crucial. That afternoon, Genther and Whiteley interviewed Danny DiCarlo on the Hinman murder and Beausoleil's confession. The only problem was that the Beausoleil trial had been going on for a week now, and both the prosecution and defense had rested. Against the objections of Beausoleil's attorney, a continuance was obtained until the following Monday, at which time the prosecution hoped to reopen its case to introduce the confession. It was agreed that if DiCarlo testified in the Beausoleil trial, they would drop the motorcycle engine theft charge against him. The LAPD, under tremendous public pressure to solve the case, wanted to offer Susan Atkins immunity in exchange for her testimony. Bugliosi was vehemently opposed. If what she told Ronnie Howard is true, he argued, Atkins personally stabbed to death Sharon Tate, Gary Hinman, and who knows how many others. We don't give that gal anything. Chief Edward Davis of the LAPD wanted to break the news that they had caught the killers in a big press conference. "We don't even have a case to take to the grand jury," Bugliosi said. "We're not even sure who the killers are, or if they're free or in custody. All we have is a good lead, but we're getting there. Let's see if on our own we can get enough evidence to nail all of them. If we can't, then as a last resort, a very, very last resort, we can turn to Atkins. But the pressure was mounting. Chief Davis was being questioned by reporters at every turn. Against Bugliosi's strong objections, a compromise was reached. They would offer Atkins a second-degree murder plea deal. That very night, as Los Angeles citizens still had no idea that suspects had been identified, 2 cars sped out of the city toward Death Valley, the last known hideout of the Manson family. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Manson had chosen a refuge so aptly named. Bugliosi and several sergeants arrived in Independence, California, the seat of Inyo County, at 1:30 in the morning. With temperatures below zero, Bugliosi layered his clothes over his pajamas and was still cold. At 6 a.m., he met with Frank Fowles, the Inyo County District Attorney, to discuss next steps. Here we see Bugliosi's meticulous attention to detail. Before heading to search Barker Ranch in Death Valley, he insisted on obtaining a proper search warrant, something that apparently wasn't common practice in rural Inyo County. The warrant he dictated ran 16 pages, listing everything they were looking for: a .22 caliber revolver, knives, rope, wire cutters, clothing items, and personal belongings of the victims. The warrant included the ranch and also an old-school bus left at the property. He explained that if they did find evidence and wished to use it in a trial, they didn't want it suppressed just because someone suddenly appeared with a pink slip saying, "I'm the real owner of the bus. I only loaned it to Charlie and you didn't get my permission." Only Bugliosi was aware how weak their case actually was. When they took the warrant to Judge John P. McMurray, the elderly jurist looked at it with amusement. "This is the first search warrant I've seen in 18 years, he told them. "In Inyo, men are men. If you knock on a door and the people inside don't want to let you in, you assume they are hiding something and bust the door in." But Bugliosi knew better. Every I needed to be dotted, every T crossed. If they were going to build a case against Manson and his followers, it needed to be airtight. But on that cold morning in Death Valley, all of that was still to come. The most notorious murder case in American history was just beginning to unfold, and the man who would become its central figure in the pursuit of justice was standing in a rural judge's office, pajamas tucked into his pants, clutching a 16-page search warrant. What would they find at Barker Ranch? Would Susan Atkins take the deal? And how would they connect all these pieces to Charles Manson, a man who may never have personally killed anyone? Join us after this quick break. By late 1969, Charles Manson and his followers had fled from Spahn Ranch to an even more remote location, Barker Ranch in Death Valley. It was one of the most isolated places in California, accessible only by traversing some of the roughest terrain imaginable. When Inyo County District Attorney Frank Fowles described the journey to Barker Ranch to Bugliosi, the prosecutor was skeptical. "Ah, come on, Frank," Bugliosi said. "It can't be that rough." He would soon eat those words. The dry washes were so narrow and rock-strewn that the men frequently had to get out of their four-wheel drive Jeep to clear boulders from the path. You could smell the rubber burning as the tires struggled for purchase on the rocky terrain. For every foot forward, they'd often slide back 2. It took them 2 hours to travel just 5 miles. This wasn't some casual retreat. This was a deliberate fortress, chosen specifically for its inaccessibility. Bugliosi, ever the strategist, made sure to have photographs taken of the washes. He wanted the jury to see just how remote an area the killers had chosen for their hiding place. As he later reflected, circumstantial evidence, a tiny speck, but of such specks, one after another, are strong cases made. No one would have chosen to live at either Barker or Myers Ranch except for one crucial feature: water. There was even a swimming pool at Barker, though like the stone ranch house and outlying shacks, it was in disrepair. The house itself was small, just a living room, bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom. Bugliosi made sure to photograph the cabinet under the sink where Manson had hidden during the police raid, a cramped space measuring just 3 by 1.5 by 1.5 feet. The scene at Barker Ranch painted a picture of a cult desperately trying to escape society. An old school bus sat abandoned nearby, its side decorated with an American flag decal bearing the slogan, "America, love it or leave it." The irony wasn't lost on Bugliosi. Bugliosi wondered, what does a family of murderers do when they're hiding from the law? What bizarre dynamics kept these young people under Manson's spell? And how do you build a case when your potential witnesses seem to exist in an alternate reality? Inside the bus, at least a foot of clothing was piled on the floor. This, Bugliosi would later learn, was standard practice for the family. Wherever they stayed, they kept a community clothing pile. When an item was needed, they'd root through until they found it. Getting down on his hands and knees, Bugliosi began searching through the pile. He was looking for two things in particular: clothing with bloodstains and boots. A bloody boot heel print had been found on the front porch of the Tate residence, with a small indentation in the heel that might provide crucial evidence. Although he found several boots, none had such a mark. And when criminalist Joe Granato tested the clothing for blood, all results were negative. But something else caught Bugliosi's attention. Among the magazines scattered in the bus were several National Geographics, all dating from 1939 to 1945, and all containing articles on Hitler. One also had photographs of Rommel and his Desert Corps. It was an unsettling glimpse into Manson's fascination with Nazi Germany, a theme that would later become central to understanding his warped worldview. On their way back to Independence, the county seat of Inyo County, they stopped in Lone Pine. While having a beer with the officers, Sergeant Sartucci mentioned something that caught Bugliosi by surprise. He and another officer had interviewed Manson in Independence weeks earlier, questioning him about both the Tate and LaBianca murders. When Bugliosi later called Lieutenant Helder from the Tate investigation team, Helder was shocked. He had no idea anyone from LAPD had ever talked to Manson. This was Bugliosi's first indication that the Tate and LaBianca detectives weren't exactly coordinating their efforts. The news from Los Angeles wasn't good either. Sergeant Lee had run ballistics comparisons on the .22 caliber bullets they'd found at Spahn Ranch against those recovered at the Tate residence. All were negative matches. But Bugliosi wasn't about to give up. He would need to cast a wider net, and that meant talking to members of the family. The next morning, while walking to the courthouse, Bugliosi spotted two young women, one carrying a baby. Taking a wild guess, he asked, "Are you Sandy and Squeaky?" They admitted they were. These weren't their real names, of course. Squeaky Fromm, whose real name was Lynette, and Sandy Good were among Manson's most devoted followers. Bugliosi identified himself and asked them to meet him at the district attorney's office at 1 p.m. They agreed, on the condition that he would buy them some candy. While waiting for the meeting, Bugliosi combed through the files that D.A. Fowles had on the Manson family. He discovered that both Squeaky and Sandy came from well-to-do families in Southern California. Squeaky's father was an aeronautical engineer in Santa Monica. Sandy's father was a San Diego stockbroker. Both girls had started college before dropping out. Squeaky at El Camino Junior College in Torrance, Sandy at the University of Oregon, and San Francisco State. According to Danny DiCarlo, when Sandy joined the family in early 1968, she had some $6,000 in stocks, which she sold and gave to Manson. Now she and her baby were on welfare. When the two women arrived for their interview, Bugliosi was immediately struck by their expressions. They seemed to radiate inner contentment, the look of true believers who had found all the answers. They smiled almost continuously, regardless of what was said. "Tell me about this love," Bugliosi asked, genuinely curious about their devotion to Manson. "Love is love. You can't define it," they replied. "Did Charlie teach them this?" "No," they insisted. Charlie didn't need to teach them. He only turned them around so they could look at themselves and see the love within. Did they believe Charlie was Jesus Christ? They only smiled enigmatically, as if sharing a secret no one else could possibly understand. Although Squeaky was 21 and Sandy 25, there was something childlike about them, as if they hadn't aged but had been arrested at a certain stage of development. Little girls playing little girl games, Bugliosi thought, including murder. Is your love for Charlie different from your love for George Spahn? Bugliosi asked Squeaky, referencing the elderly owner of the ranch where they had previously lived. No, love is love, Squeaky answered after a moment's hesitation. It's all the same. Perhaps to overcome this hesitation, she proceeded to tell Bugliosi about her relationship with the 81-year-old Spahn in graphic detail, clearly attempting to shock him. I'm not that interested in your sex life, Squeaky, Bugliosi told her, but I am very, very interested in what you know about the Tate-LaBianca, Hinman, and other murders. Neither woman's expression changed in the slightest. The smiles remained fixed. They knew nothing about any crimes, they insisted. All they knew about was love. Bugliosi continued questioning them for a long time, but their answers remained evasive. When asked where they were on a certain date, they would reply, "There is no such thing as time." Their responses served as both non-answers and shields. Bugliosi wanted to get past those shields, to learn what they really felt. He couldn't. Something else struck him. Each was, in her own way, a pretty young woman, but there was a sameness about them that was stronger than their individuality, something he would notice again that afternoon when talking to other female family members. They all had the same expressions, same patterned responses, same tone of voice, same lack of distinct personality. They reminded me less of human beings than Barbie dolls, Bugliosi would later recall. Looking at Sandy's almost beatific smile, Bugliosi remembered something Frank Fowles had told him, and a chill ran up his spine. While still in jail in Independence, Sandy had been overheard telling another family member, "I've finally reached the point where I can kill my parents." Later that afternoon, Bugliosi interviewed more female family members still being held in the local jail: Leslie, Weish, Snake, Brenda, and Gypsy. Like Squeaky and Sandy, they accepted his bribe of candy and gum and told him nothing of importance. Their answers seemed rehearsed. Often, they gave identical responses. Bugliosi realized that if they were going to get any of these women to talk, they would need to separate them. There was a cohesion, a kind of cement that held them together. Part of it was undoubtedly their strange relationship with Manson. Part was their shared experiences as the family. But Bugliosi wondered if another ingredient wasn't fear. Fear of what the others would say if they talked. Fear of what the others would do. The only way to find out would be to keep them apart. But due to the smallness of the jail in Independence, that couldn't be done there. Besides Manson, there was only one male family member still in custody, 18-year-old Steve Grogan, known as Clem. His rap sheet showed a disturbing pattern: possession of dangerous drugs, shoplifting, disturbing the peace, possession of marijuana, loitering, grand theft, and most disturbingly, child molesting and indecent exposure. Grogan had been observed exposing himself to children ages 4 to 5. "The kids wanted me to," he had explained to arresting officers who caught him in the act. "The thing fell out of my pants and the parents got excited," he later told a court-appointed psychiatrist. The psychiatrist had recommended against committing him to Camarillo State Hospital because the minor is much too aggressive to remain in a setting which does not provide containment facilities. The court decided otherwise, sending him for a 90-day observation period. He remained a grand total of 2 days before walking away, aided by one of the girls from the family. His escape had occurred on July 19, 1969, in time for him to potentially be present for the Hinman, Tate, and LaBianca murders. Currently, as a result of the Barker Ranch raid, Grogan was charged with grand theft auto and possession of an illegal weapon, a sawed-off shotgun. At the instigation of his attorney, he had been examined by 2 psychiatrists who had decided he was presently insane. Bugliosi asked Fowles to request a jury trial and fight the insanity plea. If he eventually brought Grogan to trial in Los Angeles for the Tate murders, he didn't want the defense introducing evidence that a court had already found him insane. In reviewing the psychiatric reports, Bugliosi found disturbing glimpses into Grogan's mind, or perhaps more accurately, into Manson's influence over him. Asked why he hated his father, Grogan replied, "I'm my father and I don't hate myself." He claimed that love is everything, but also revealed he couldn't accept interracial brotherhood. Other quotes from Grogan: "I'm dying a little every day. My ego is dying and knows he's dying and struggles hard. When you're free of ego, you're free of everything. Whatever you say is right for yourself. Whoever you think I am, that's who I am." Reading these statements, Bugliosi wondered, was this the philosophy of Clem or Charles Manson? He'd heard the same thoughts, in several instances even identical words from the girls. If psychiatrists had examined one of Manson's followers and, based on such responses, found him insane, what did that say about their leader? As Bugliosi continued his journey into the heart of the Manson family, the picture grew increasingly disturbing. He was dealing not just with murderers, but with people who seemed to have surrendered their very identities to Charles Manson. The question wasn't just who had committed these brutal murders, but how Manson had transformed these young men and women, many from good homes and with bright futures, into willing killers. How had he convinced them that love meant murder? How had he so thoroughly brainwashed them that they spoke with one voice, thought with one mind, and appeared ready to kill even their own parents at his command? But perhaps most troublingly for Bugliosi, how do you build a case against a man who might never have personally killed anyone? How do you prove that the hand that held the knife was guided by Manson's mind? The prosecutor faced a daunting challenge. He needed evidence, he needed witnesses, and he needed to crack the code of silence that bound the family together. Let's have a quick break. The first time Charles Manson appeared in court, he hardly looked the part of a man capable of orchestrating one of the most notorious murder sprees in American history. Flanked by 5 sheriff's deputies, he was being arraigned, not for murder, but for an arson charge involving a Michigan loader. To anyone seeing him for the first time, Manson's physical presence might have been surprising. He looked about 5'2", slight of build, with long brown hair brushing his shoulders and a beard in progress. He wore a pair of fringed buckskins, expensive, eye-catching, and carefully chosen. Despite the handcuffs, his gait was calm, almost casual, betraying no fear or tension. He looked utterly at ease. It was hard to reconcile this almost unimposing figure with the chilling accounts provided by former followers like Susan Atkins and Danny DiCarlo. But looks can be deceiving, and to underestimate Charles Manson would have been a fatal mistake. If what his followers claimed was true, Manson didn't just kill. He had the terrifying ability to convince others to kill for him. His so-called girls often spoke of karma, the idea that whatever energy you send into the world eventually returns to you. And as he stood there in handcuffs under heavy guard, it was impossible not to wonder, did Manson feel that his karma had finally caught up with him? Authorities certainly weren't treating him like a common arson suspect. 5 deputies? That wasn't routine. And they knew, if he made bail, there was a strong chance he'd disappear. The stakes were high. If Manson got out, the fragile case building around him and his followers might collapse. Witnesses would clam up, leads would vanish. By November 22, 1969, investigators were in overdrive. That weekend was spent poring over hundreds of LAPD reports, documents from the Inyo County investigation, sheriff's reports from the Spahn Ranch raid, and countless criminal records. LAPD alone had conducted over 450 interviews in connection with the Tate murders. Yet, ironically, the most valuable tip so far had come from a former prostitute, not a detective. One goal was clear: connect the victims of the Tate-LaBianca murders to the Manson family. Find the link. Uncover the motive. Because no matter how bizarre or irrational a crime may seem, every act of violence has a reason. It might be twisted, personal, or buried in delusion, but it's there. And in this case, finding that motive would be the key to understanding the madness. As the case unfolded, it became more important than ever to understand not just what Manson had done, but who he was, and what made him capable of controlling lives and ending them without ever lifting a knife himself. 5 victims in Benedict Canyon, 2 more in Los Feliz, all brutally murdered within 48 hours. And by late November 1969, the investigation was hanging by a thread. When Vincent Bugliosi took over the Tate-LaBianca murder case, LAPD had already scaled back from 19 detectives to just 6. For reasons that defy logic, 4 detectives remained assigned to the LaBianca murders with 2 victims, while the Tate case, with 5 victims, had just 2 detectives. The most infamous murder case of the century was slowly being buried under bureaucracy and a lack of coordination. But Bugliosi was not a man who accepted defeat. What happened next would change everything. On November 24, 1969, Bugliosi called in Sergeants Calkins and McGann and handed them a detailed list of tasks. Check every family member's fingerprints against the 25 unidentified prints at Cielo Drive. Interview Terry Melcher. Put out a want on Charles Tex Montgomery. And perhaps most critically, those eyeglasses found at the scene. Who did they belong to? How do we do that? Calkins asked. They're not about to admit it. I presume you talked to their acquaintances, parents, relatives, Bugliosi replied, with the methodical precision that would become his signature. If you can check out the glasses with eye doctors all over the United States and Canada, you can certainly check out some 35 people. But when Bugliosi pressed further about the glasses, he discovered something astonishing. William Garretson, the caretaker who had been at the Tate residence during the murders and was briefly the prime suspect, had never been asked if the glasses were his. The most crucial piece of physical evidence, and no one had bothered to check if they belonged to the one person still alive, known to be at the scene. How does this happen in what was already being called the murder of the century? Through his attorney, Bugliosi learned that Garretson did occasionally wear glasses. Eventually, LAPD contacted police in Garretson's hometown of Lancaster, Ohio, who obtained his prescription from his local optometrist. Not even close. The glasses remained a mystery. Another interesting story about the glasses was revealed much later. Bruce Lee was a close friend of Sharon Tate, Roman Polanski, and Jay Sebring, and he lived close to Cielo Drive. Several months after the murders, Bruce Lee mentioned to Roman Polanski that he had lost his glasses. "I never liked your old pair anyway," Polanski told Lee. "Why don't I drive you to my optician's and buy you a new frame as a gift?" Bruce was the only person Polanski knew personally who had the physical skills to hurt a bunch of people at once. Bruce was the toughest guy he knew, and Bruce knew weapons. When Lee told the optician his prescription, Polanski realized his suspicion was unfounded. He never told Lee he suspected him, and he never publicly admitted it until he recounted the story in his memoir, which came out in 1985, more than a decade after Lee's death. While the trail of the glasses went cold, another lead was heating up. 5 of Charles Manson's female followers were still in jail in Independence, California. LAPD decided to bring them to Los Angeles for individual interrogation at Sybil Brand Institute for Women. A keep-away order was placed on each, meaning they could have no contact with each other or with anyone else LAPD designated, including Susan Atkins. It was a smart move. Questioned separately, there was a chance one might crack. But even as LAPD prepared to question these women, something alarming happened. TV commentator George Putnam announced he would soon reveal who had committed the Tate murders. There had been a leak. The district attorney's office and LAPD immediately reached out to media outlets, asking them to hold off on publishing any information. They agreed, but only for 1 week, until December 1st. The clock was ticking. Meanwhile, Frank Fowles, the Inyo County District Attorney, called Bugliosi with disturbing news. Sandra Good, one of Manson's followers, had been overheard saying that Charlie was going to go alibi. If brought to trial, they would produce evidence showing he wasn't even in Los Angeles when the murders occurred. Even more alarming, a police informant in Las Vegas reported that Charles Tex Montgomery and Bruce Davis had been spotted driving a green panel Volkswagen. They were allegedly trying to raise money to bail out Manson, and if they failed, they planned to kill someone. The threat was considered credible enough that Fowles sent his own family out of town for the Thanksgiving weekend. The investigation was about to enter its most crucial phase. But first, another startling development. On November 26th, the jury in the trial of Bobby Beausoleil for the murder of Gary Hinman announced they were deadlocked. The case against him had been so weak that prosecutors hadn't even sought the death penalty. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Office immediately asked Bugliosi to take over the prosecution for the retrial. As if the Tate-LaBianca cases weren't enough, Bugliosi now had a third murder case on his plate. All three were connected through one man, Charles Manson. That same day, Virginia Graham made a fateful decision. She had been hesitating about coming forward with information even after her cellmate at Corona Women's Prison, Susan Atkins, had confessed to her involvement in the Tate murders. Virginia had told her husband during a visit about what she'd heard, and he'd advised her, "Mind your own business." But Virginia couldn't keep quiet any longer. "I can see a lot of things I don't say anything about," she would later explain, "but this is sick. This is so bad that I don't know who could mind their own business with this." She went to her counselor at Corona, who called LAPD. That afternoon, Sergeant Nielsen arrived at the prison and recorded her story. Unlike Ronnie Howard, another inmate who had heard Atkins' confession, Virginia clearly recalled Sadie saying there were 3 girls and 1 man involved in the Tate homicides. Like Ronnie, however, she presumed the man, Charles, was Manson himself. This was about to become critical information. In a bizarre twist in a case already littered with bizarre twists, remember when Ronnie Howard was trying to get the information she had from Susan Atkins' confessions to the LAPD, and she was begging female Deputy Sergeant Broom to let her call them. And when she wouldn't let Ronnie call them, she asked Sergeant Broom to call them on her behalf and explained in detail that Susan Atkins had confessed to killing Sharon Tate. Well, it turns out Sergeant Broom didn't need to call them. Unbelievably, she was actually dating one of the Tate detectives, but apparently they had other more important things to talk about. That same afternoon and evening, LAPD began interrogating the 5 Manson girls at Sybil Brand Institute. The interviews reveal both the inexperience of some detectives and the extraordinary conditioning of Manson's followers. Sergeant Manuel Chick Gutierrez interviewed 16-year-old Diane Lake, who had given her age as 21. The transcript of the interview is frankly shocking. Gutierrez immediately accused her of involvement in all 14 murders that they believed the family had committed, despite having no evidence linking her to any of them. "Somebody's going to go down the tubes, and somebody's going to get the pill in the gas chamber for a whole bunch of murders which you are a part of," he told the terrified teenager. He offered her complete immunity, something he had no authority to grant, if she would tell him what she knew. For nearly 2 hours, Gutierrez interrogated Diane, obtaining little more than the admission that she liked candy bars. Ironically, Diane Lake would later become one of the prosecution's most important witnesses, but not because of Gutierrez's threats. It was the patient, sympathetic understanding of the Inyo County authorities that eventually earned her trust. Gutierrez had no better luck with 18-year-old Ruth Ann Morehouse, known in the family as Weesh. When she insisted she knew nothing, he told her, "You're going to go to the joint. They may drop that pill on you. They may drop that cyanide pill on you." "I haven't done anything," she screamed. "I don't know anything about it." The remaining 2 women, Catherine Scher, known as Gypsy, and Nancy Pittman, were similarly uncooperative. But then came Leslie. 20-year-old Leslie Sankston, whose true name, Van Houten, was not yet known to authorities, was interviewed by Sergeant Mike McGann. Unlike Gutierrez, McGann tried a variety of approaches, appealing to her parents, her conscience, the hideousness of the murders. What finally worked was Leslie's own tendency to play games, to hint that she knew things the police didn't. Throughout the interview, she made small admissions, not of participation but of knowledge. When asked what she'd heard about the Tate murders, she replied, "I'm deaf. I didn't hear nothing," and then laughed. When McGann said he knew 3 people who had gone to the Tate residence and suspected a 4th but didn't know the 5th, Leslie replied, "I have a pretty good idea." Later, when McGann asked who she saw leave Spahn Ranch on the night of August 8th, the night of the Tate murders, she laughed and said, "Oh, I went to bed early that night. Really, I don't want to talk about it." "Who went?" McGann pressed. "That's what I don't want to talk about." Though she wouldn't discuss the murders directly, she was willing to talk about members of the family. She called them the nicest group of people and said her favorite was Clem, describing him as fun to be with. She called Sadie, Susan Atkins, really kind of a nice person, but admitted she tends to be on the rough side. During the interview, McGann shocked Leslie with the news that a family member called Zero had died playing Russian roulette. Her reaction was telling. Zero was playing Russian roulette all by himself? She said sarcastically, clearly suggesting she didn't believe the official story. Sensing an advantage, McGann pressed on. He told her he knew 5 people had gone to the Tate residence, 3 girls and 2 men, and that one of the men was Charles Manson. "I don't think Charlie was in on any of them," Leslie replied. She then said she had heard only 4 people went to the Tate residence. "I would say that 3 of them were girls. I would say that there were probably more girls involved than men." Then came the bombshell. "I heard one girl who didn't murder anyone while they were up there." When McGann asked who that was, Leslie replied, "A girl by the name of Linda." This was new information. Susan Atkins had told Ronnie Howard regarding the second night of killings. Linda wasn't in on this one, suggesting she had been present the first night. But until now, investigators hadn't been able to confirm this. Leslie couldn't or wouldn't provide Linda's last name, saying only that she was small, about 5 feet 2, thin, with light brown hair, and hadn't been arrested with the others. Later in the interview, McGann showed Leslie mugshots from the Barker Ranch raid. When handed one of a girl booked as Marnie Reeves, Leslie identified her as Katie, another name Atkins had mentioned. By the end of the interview, McGann had learned that 3 girls had gone to the Tate residence: Sadie, Katie, and Linda. He'd learned that Linda was one girl who didn't murder someone, strongly implying that the 2 other girls had. And he'd learned that Katie was also known as Marnie Reeves and had previously been booked under the name Mary Ann Scott. But Leslie had learned something too, that Tex, Katie, and Linda were still free, and most importantly, that Susan Atkins was talking. There was a break in the questioning. It's standard police procedure to leave a suspect alone for a while, to think about his or her answers, to provide a transition between soft and hard interrogation. It also gives the officers an opportunity to get a toilet break. When McGann returned, he decided to shock Leslie some more. "Sadie has already told 15 people in the jailhouse that she was there, that she took part in it." Leslie: "That's incredible." Then, after a thoughtful pause, "Didn't she mention anyone else?" "No, except for Charlie and Katie." Leslie: "She mentioned Charlie and Katie?" "That's right." Leslie: "That's pretty nauseating." "She said Katie was there, and I know it was Marnie Reeves." "You know it was Marnie Reeves, don't you?" Leslie nodded her head affirmatively. Sadie also said, "I went out the next night and killed 2 more people. Out in the hills." Leslie: "Sadie said that?" Leslie was astonished. With good reason. Though the LAPD were as yet unaware of it, Leslie knew Susan Atkins had never entered the LaBianca residence. She knew that because she had been there and participated in the murders. After this, Leslie refused to answer any further questions. McGann asked her, "Why?" "Because if Zero was suddenly found playing Russian roulette, I could be found playing Russian roulette. We'll give you 24-hour protection from now on." Leslie laughed sarcastically. "Oh, that would really be nice. I'd rather stay in jail." Even with the keep-away order on the girls, it wouldn't be long before this information got back to Charles Manson. The race was on to build a case before Manson could silence potential witnesses, one way or another. What happened next would shock the nation and reveal the full horror of Charles Manson's control over his followers. In the next episode, we find out how a single fingerprint blows the case wide open, But after this quick break, we'll hear from our resident crime experts, Simon and Tom.
Alex, what a job you are doing. The detail here is absolutely incredible. I'm really enjoying it, but I'm finding myself that I have to rewind a bit because I wasn't listening hard enough because of that detail. It really is so involved because there's so many aspects to the case, isn't there? Apart from just the police investigation that we'll talk about.
Yeah, there really are, Simon. We've done some deep dives before, but this is a deep, deep, deep dive. It really is. And Alex, congratulations. 2 questions, Alex. Clearly, there's going to be a lot of learning here for the investigators once the case is concluded. I was always struck by the efficiency of the task force system in the States. When I was out there, that was 20 years after this, obviously, but the task force system was pretty good. If they had a particular problem, they drew all the agencies together to concentrate under a unified command, a bit like we do here now. Now, there's no mention so far of a task force being brought together, and I just wondered whether that didn't happen at that time. Perhaps the task force system wasn't in place. The other thing, and you'll maybe come to it, but if you don't, could you find out, Alex, whether there was a review? We had cases which went wrong or were going wrong. We had a 60-day review process, which we appointed independent people to come in and take a short, sharp look. 60 days, so it didn't drag on. It was a 2-month review. Was there anything like that in place for either the Tate or the LaBianca murders? Was there any outside scrutiny of where the squads were going? Because clearly they were going very much astray until Bugliosi, the DA, came on the scene. And he strikes me as a very impressive character. But Simon, I've got to say, I thought the job that Bugliosi was doing in drawing the strings together should have been done by the senior investigators. That should have been done by the police.
I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, Tom. All of these things will come out as we progress in future episodes.
Okay.
I think the thing to remember, Simon, is the role of the DA. We tend to think of the DA as being like the Procurator Fiscal. It's not, it's a different role. For a start, the DA is an elected official. He's not appointed. Quite often, the DA is a springboard to the mayor or to a place in Congress. When you look at some of the senior politicians in America just now, a lot of them have at some stage been a DA, and it's a kind of a testing ground for them. So we've got to be careful that we don't make the wrong comparisons here. But I've got to say, Bugliosi seems to be, I like this guy. I really like this guy.
He really had the bit between his teeth. Alec actually covered it on the podcast, Tom, because he said when he first talks about Vincent at the start of episode 15, he says that the DA's office was expected to handle evidence that the police bring in and then present the case to first the grand jury and then to the court itself if it went to that stage. But Vincent never worked like that. Bugliosi took it as a personal thing that he was going to help investigate it. And we tend to laugh at that. We think of Quincy or something like that, don't we?
Yeah.
He used to go out and solve cases on his own volition. But here, Bugliosi becomes really the centrepiece for the evidence, especially because of the 2 incidents, the 2 murder scenes. He's very proactive. We never see a fiscal. You were senior investigator of many cases. At what point would you go and see the fiscal and talk about the ins and outs of a case?
It changed over time, Simon, because back in the day, the fiscals were consulted and were informed. That was particularly the case in the likes of the Ruxton murders. As time went on, latterly in my time, the fiscals would sometimes come out and attend at the scene of death where the body lay, but only fleetingly, and just to familiarise themselves. And then the fiscals took a step back. Where it really became involved is when you'd gathered a body of evidence and there was an advocate depute who was appointed to present the case in court. Then they became proactive and started to ask questions because, of course, they were going to have to get up in the High Court and present the case. So in the World's End case, once we rejuvenated the case in 2004, we had an advocate depute came on board and a very good, able guy too. Unfortunately, he moved on and we got somebody that wasn't as good initially. Anyway, that's another story. But the first advocate deputy we got, who is now a very senior judge, was first class. He asked a lot of probing questions, which he knew the court would want answered. Fortunately, we had all the answers for him, but it was a great sort of test of
Yeah.
our case. And he would say,
Yeah.
well, what about this and what about that and what about the next thing? And we'd say, here's the answer, A, B, C, D.
Devil's
Sure.
advocate is really good.
That's right, the devil's
Yeah.
advocate. That's a very good way to put it, Simon. He was an advocate.
That's true. I never even thought.
He knew what questions that he knew how the defence would probe, and he wanted to make sure that the case had the answers to these questions, which is absolutely first class.
Yeah. A good example of Bugliosi at the start of the episode is when he visits the ranch and they're looking for shells, casings and cartridges, etc., hoping to get a fingerprint or get some kind of evidence. We don't need to go into the details of that because the episode's there and people have listened to it. What got me was when somebody said to him, for goodness sake, that's only a tiny speck. I think it might have been a bit of blood or something that had been found. He said to them that these tiny specks are part of the circumstantial case that builds up the big picture. I thought that was very telling, that he was the one looking for the detail. The police were looking for a headline. They were looking to get this off their books because of the celebrity that was involved. He was already thinking about the case he was going to present in court, and that informed everything he did, even down to photographs, which hadn't been done at some of the places.
I was very impressed by that. The fact that he went up to Death Valley, which, from the description, was the most difficult place to get to in the whole wide world, that he went up there personally to have a look. And you're right, he's putting together this circumstantial case, which we've discussed before, this fine mesh net of detail, no detail too small that can tie one little thing down, because he knew he would have to go before a grand jury and eventually in a trial, perhaps without primary evidence. So he had to have the whole thing tied up as tightly as he could. Most impressive stuff. But again, Simon, I would have hoped, and Alex will find out for us, after the event, after all this was done, was there a debrief when Bugliosi was telling the LAPD and the LA County Sheriffs, listen guys, you should have been doing this.
Yeah.
This is best practice. This is what we require. Because if that was not the case, then there was a lot of learning that was missed.
Tom, did the American police, I know that we're talking 60s here, before even your time, but would the American police, in your experience, have an incident room for a major inquiry like this? And this would be two incident rooms, of course, because they had separated the two murders, or two murder scenes.
Yes, but remember that when you talk about the American police, you're talking about a whole spectrum. You're talking about absolutely first-class professional stuff, way in advance of what we were at that time with equipment that we could only dream about. And you're talking about one man, the small town county sheriff, there's a crime takes place, he doesn't want anybody trampling on his turf. And there's all of these political things and turf wars and people wanting to protect their own position. The thing is, a lot of these small police departments, they were dependent on funding from the local mayor and the local township. If a murder happened and they couldn't handle it, what does that say about that department? What does it say about the need to have that department at all? And of course, the other thing about the American scene is that police departments came and went. I once asked a question when I was at the FBI, how many police departments are there in the United States of America? No idea. No idea, because small township police departments sprung up and then faded away and went away and disappeared. So it was a complete movable feast and very, very difficult to draw a comparison between their system and our system.
Let me pick your brains here, Tom, given that. So they've got an instant room, like I'm thinking instant room.
Yeah.
But for an instant room to be effective, for it to be the hub of the inquiry, all of the information being gathered by all of the detectives, agencies, and whoever's working the case, whether it be roadblocks, whether it be the media, whatever's being discussed about the case has to be collated and put through the incident room. The SIO and his team can sift through that, which informs the next actions. We're always checking things out, eliminating things, comparing things, and looking for the commonalities. So their instant room had no chance of doing that because of all those agencies not putting in information. Back to our incident room, how does an SIO keep a tab of all that information? I'm thinking of some of the inquiries I worked in, the Bluebell Woods, lots of murders where It was media intense, lots of pressure. How does an SIO keep on top of all that wealth, especially in the first week, door-to-door inquiries, all of that stuff coming through the incident room? How do you control that and sift it?
Well, that of course was the great art. The great SIOs were the people who could see through all the chaff to get to the wheat. Before the home system, when we were dealing with the old index card system, which they would be working with here in 1969, it was a high-risk business. Remember, in relation to the Tate case, and Alex has not covered this yet, but maybe he will, there would be thousands of pieces of duff information coming in about that case because of the celebrity of the people involved.
Yeah.
Because round about LA and Hollywood, there'd be mediums and spiritualists. There would be false information, false confessions, all sorts of things happening because of the celebrity. And it would be very difficult to sift through that. In the case of LAPD, in 1969, they would have had an incident room similar to ours in 1969. But that bears no comparison to the incident rooms we worked in latterly with the home system. The home system changed everything and was not introduced into the United States till almost 20 years later.
Brilliant, Tom. Thank you for that insight. That's insightful that very few people could see it from where you saw it. To move along, there was a thing about George Spahn, the 81-year-old owner of the ranch. He had his girlfriend, Squeaky, who had been a member of the family, Sandy and Squeaky. I was interested when they were being interviewed. The brainwave was introduced, and it's something that we relied on a lot with when there was co-accused or suspects, was the dividing rule to separate prisoners. It seemed to take them a while to realise that was the only way they were going to get them. I tell a story from my book about going to prison to interview people about a riot. When they were all together in the room, they were cheeky, they were cocky, they were aggressive, they were dismissive. But as you took them out of the room one at a time for interview purposes, within the prison environment, of course, they were absolutely compliant, if not want to be your best pal in the world. But the minute you took them back to that room again with their peers, the other prisoners, they would shrug you off and swear at you and tell them nothing. So that separating of them I thought was interesting. It was the only way they were going to get these women, the family members, and they really struggled to get into their heads to get them to talk at all because they were so loyal to them, weren't they?
Yeah, that's right, Simon. The separation of prisoners was accidental because of the number of people they had. They'd hoovered up so many people that they couldn't put them all in one establishment. That was an accident of fate. But coming back to your comment about the group dynamics of people in a group or alone, that is absolutely true of suspects. It was also true of police officers. If you wanted to find the truth of something, then don't go to a big group of people. Don't go into the mess room at briefing time and say, hey guys, what happened last night? You're not going to get much there.
So episode 15 started with talking about the print, and it finished really with that summation, if you like. That single fingerprint is what started to blow the case wide open. But a lot of work to do yet, and it was not just the print, but it was Bugliosi's attitude and dedication and determination that started to drive it then and start to bring some of the strands together, Tom, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And it's a classic case, isn't it? That here you have a case where you've got a print at the scene, at the crime scene, a print in blood. Absolutely superb. And out there in the world, you've got that print on record, and it's a case of tying the two together.
There's so many stories within stories here, isn't there? We could talk all day about the Beach Boys. We could talk all day about the Beatles connection. There's certain things that jump out at you. And one for me was one of my childhood heroes. It was the great Bruce Lee, sadly deceased. He lived quite close to the locus of the Tate murders. He knew Polanski and all that crew. In fact, he taught them self-defense. He was involved in their world. And there was a wee thing about a pair of glasses that were found at the locus and never identified. Coincidentally, Bruce had lost a pair of specs. For a while, Polanski thought that he might have been involved, but it turned out that they got a prescription and sorted it out anyway, that it wasn't Bruce. Yeah. But my wee story was that when I was 15 years of age, Enter the Dragon came out. And me and my pals were desperate to see it. So we went uptown in Glasgow. I must have been the tallest at the time because I paid to get in and got in. But to my shame, and I hope there's a statute of limitations here somewhere, I opened the fire escape door and my 3 pals got in as well. And we all got to see the Bruce Lee Enter the Dragon film because he was a cult figure at that time. Kung Fu and martial arts and all that was very new to the country at that time.
Yeah, he was a remarkable athlete. Most of the stunts and things he did himself. There's an even more remarkable thing about that story of yours, Simon, because I bet you that's the last time you paid for anything.
Moving right along. Tom, brilliant season. It's heating up a bit now, isn't it? Especially now that we've got somebody. I suppose the role that he's playing here, Bugliosi, is the senior investigating officer to some degree. He's starting to pull the strands together and starting to look at the minutiae of all the details that are coming in. So let's see what Alex comes up with for us. I'm really looking forward to it.
I was interested in Spahn Ranch and the old fella Spahn. That's a perfect example of something we came across a lot, and that's cuckooing, what we call cuckooing, where a group of criminals will pick on a vulnerable person and move in on them, either take over a room or take over their house. And in this case, what Charlie did was more or less take over the whole of the Spahn Ranch and get Squeaky to provide services to old Spahn as the quid pro quo. It's another example of cuckooing. And of course, right up to date in the county lines drug issue, which we're struggling with now in this country, that's a phenomenon which is commonly seen, is these drugs gangs moving in on vulnerable people, preying on them and taking over their houses to act as basis for the county lines.
I suppose it's something you and I just know instinctively, like every police officer does, but that's what criminals do. They're always looking for the weak link. They're always looking for the easy route. They're always looking for the vulnerable, whether it be drug addiction, whether it be old people to prey on. That's what criminals do for a living.